The first time I saw Marin Sayer, half of Cedar Wells was pretending she wasn't there, and the other half was working hard at it. She'd come in on the Tuesday freight, perched up beside the crates with her hands folded in her lap and a carpet bag at her feet, and when the wagon rolled to a stop in front of Hannity's store, the whole street took one look at the long white scar that ran from her jaw down into her collar and decided, all at once and without a word said aloud, that she was no concern of theirs. Men found things to study in the dirt. Mrs. Prout, who ran the boarding house and the gossip both, turned a quarter circle on her heel and got very interested in a bolt of calico. The freight agent set her bag down on the boardwalk like it might be catching, tipped his hat at the air a foot to the left of her face, and went back to his mules. I'd seen a lot of cruelty on that frontier. I never did learn which kind was worse, the loud kind that came with fists, or that quiet kind, the kind that just decides you're not worth the trouble of looking at. I want you to understand I wasn't any better than the rest of them that morning. I was sitting up on my wagon seat outside the feed store with my coat collar turned up and my hat pulled down, and I was looking at her the same flat way I looked at everything in those days, which is to say I wasn't really looking at all. 2 winters my wife Clara had been in the ground by then, and somewhere in there I'd quit seeing the world in color. I did my work. I fed my stock. I came to town when the larder ran low, and I went home when it was full. I told myself, in the long way a man tells himself a thing without ever once saying it plain, that the best of my life was finished and buried out on the rise behind the house, and that what was left to me was just the chore of going on until I could lie down beside her. 41 years old, and I'd already decided I was done living. I just hadn't gotten around to dying yet. So I wasn't paying that scarred woman any mind, but my Etta was. Etta was 6 that year, and she'd been 3 when her mother went, which meant she carried Clara around inside her the way you carry a song you can't quite remember, a feeling with the words worn off. She was sitting beside me on the wagon seat in her too-short coat, swinging her boots, and I felt her go still the way a barn cat goes still. I followed her eyes. She was watching Marin Sayer stand there alone on the boardwalk with her bag at her feet and her chin up and nowhere in the world to go, and the whole town flowing around her like creek water around a stone. Then before I could get a hand on her, my girl was down off that wagon. "Etta," I said, not loud. I'd lost the habit of loud. She didn't hear me, or she chose not to, which with Etta was generally the same thing. She walked straight across that dusty street in her scuffed boots, right up to the strange, scarred woman the whole town had unseen, and she reached up and took hold of 2 of her fingers. I was already off the seat by then. I came across the street fast, the way you do when your child has laid hands on a stranger, with an apology half built in my mouth. But I stopped a few feet short because of the look on the woman's face. She was looking down at my daughter's small hand wrapped around her fingers like she'd never in her life been touched on purpose. Like she didn't know what to do with it. Her eyes had gone bright and wet, and she was holding herself dead still, the way you'd hold still if a wild thing had come up out of the brush and decided to trust you, and you were afraid that any move at all would send it bolting. "Hello," Etta said up at her, grave as a judge. "Hello," the woman answered. Her voice came out rough like it hadn't been used in a while. "You've got a hurt on your neck," Etta said, because Etta said the thing nobody else would. "I do," the woman said. "Does it pain you?" "Not anymore," she said, "not the skin part." My daughter nodded like that was a perfectly sensible answer, which I suppose it was. "My mama's dead," Etta informed her. "We've got nobody to mind us proper. Wesley burned the beans Sunday. Are you somebody's?" And I watched that scarred woman open her mouth to answer my child, and find she couldn't. I got there then. "I'm sorry," I said, and put my hand on Etta's shoulder. "She doesn't mean any harm, she just hasn't got any sense about what's hers to ask." "It's all right," the woman said. She had her composure back mostly. Up close the scar was a hard thing to look at and an easy thing to look past once you'd done it the once. She had a plain, steady sort of face under it, brown eyes that took their time, hands that had done work. Children are honest, I don't mind honest. She crouched down to Etta's level, slow, and I saw it cost her something to do it, like an old hurt in the hip. No, she said gently. I'm not anybody's, not just now. Where are you going to sleep? Etta asked. The woman's eyes flicked up to mine, just for a breath, and then back down to my girl, and she said lightly, like it was nothing, I expect I'll figure that out. And there it was. That was the moment, though I didn't know it yet. I want to tell you I was moved, that my dead heart turned over in my chest. The truth is plainer and less to my credit. The truth is I was tired, and I had 2 children I was failing, and a house going to ruin behind me, and a hired girl who'd quit the month before because the loneliness of the place got into her. The truth is I needed help, and here was a woman nobody else would have, standing in front of me with my daughter holding her hand. I did the arithmetic a man does. I didn't see her, not yet. I saw a solution. You looking for a place? I said. She stood back up, took her time about it, looked at me square, scar and all, no flinching, and I'll say this, she didn't fawn, didn't soften, didn't do any of the things a desperate person learns to do. Depends on the place, she said. I've got a ranch out on the Stony Run, hour and a half out, 2 children. Their mother's 2 years gone, and I'm no hand in a kitchen and worse with their hair. I jerked my chin at Etta. That one. And a boy 10. The last girl I hired couldn't stand the quiet. I'll be honest with you, it's far out and it's lonesome and the work doesn't quit. Room and board and a fair wage. That's all it is. I made sure to say that last part. That's all it is. I said it for both of us, I think. I was telling her not to expect anything tender from me because I had nothing tender left, and maybe I was telling myself the same. She looked at me a long moment. Then she looked down at Etta, who was still holding 2 of her fingers and gazing up at her like she'd hung the moon. I can cook, Marin said. I can sew and I can doctor a fever, and I'm not afraid of quiet. I've had a great deal of quiet. She paused. You should know the rest of the town won't tell you the half of it, so I will. There was a fire. My husband and my boy were in the house. I was not. She said it flat, the way you say a thing you've had to say too many times to break over anymore. I got this getting to the door. I didn't get them. People look at me and they see the fire. That's why nobody in that street will hire me. I'd as soon you knew before we drove an hour and a half. The street had gone a little quiet around us, the way a crowd does when it's eavesdropping and pretending not to. I looked at her, and for just a second, the first time in 2 years maybe, I actually saw a person standing in front of me instead of a chore I had to get through. A woman who'd walked out of a burning house alive and never forgiven herself for it, who carried her dead the way I carried mine, who just laid the worst thing in her life out flat in a dirt street in front of a stranger and a gawking town, because she'd rather be turned down honest than taken on and sent back. Mr. Hargrove, I said. Eli. Marin Sayer. Well, Mrs. Sayer, I said. I lost mine to the fever, and I've spent 2 years wishing it had been me instead, so I'm not going to be the one to hold a fire against you. Get your bag. The boy's minding the team down the street, and he'll be wondering where his sister got to. Something went across her face, not a smile. We weren't either of us in the smiling way, but something eased, some long-braced thing in her shoulders. All right, she said. And Etta, who had not let go of her fingers that whole time, looked up at me with her whole small face lit, and said the words I'd remember the rest of my days. Daddy, she said, she's the mama I want. I felt the whole street hear it. I felt Marin Sayer go rigid beside me, and I did what a coward does. I picked up her carpet bag so I'd have something to do with my hands, and I said, gruff as I knew how, she's the housekeeper, Etta. Don't go saying things. And I walked off toward the wagon, and I didn't look at either of them, because my eyes had done something I hadn't allowed them to do in 2 years, and I was not going to let the town of Cedar Wells watch a grown man go to pieces in the street. The ride out was mostly quiet. Wesley sat up front with me, stiff and wary, throwing looks back at the woman in the wagon bed. He was 10 and he was the man of that house in his own mind, and he didn't trust anybody come to take a piece of it. Etta rode in the back with Marin and talked the whole hour and a half about the dog, about the calf with the white face, about how the beans had burned and how Wesley had cried and said he hadn't, about her mother's hair ribbon she kept in a tin. Marin listened. That was the thing about her I'd come to understand over the months. She didn't fill up the air. She listened like it mattered, like a child telling you about a calf was the most important news in the territory. And after 2 years in a house where I'd grunted at my own children and they'd learned not to expect more, the sound of somebody actually listening to them did something to me I couldn't have named. We came over the last rise as the sun was going down, and there was the place. The low house, the barn, the corrals, the cottonwoods along the creek, and behind the house on the rise the white picket I'd built around Clara's grave because I couldn't stand the thought of the stock walking over her. And on the porch post the lantern. I'd hung that lantern the first winter Clara and I were married, so she'd have a light to come home to from the hen house in the dark. After she died I kept lighting it. Every night. I didn't let myself think about why. There was nobody coming home in the dark anymore, just me, already home and 2 children asleep. But every evening at dusk I'd go out and put a match to that lantern, and every morning I'd snuff it, and if you'd asked me, I'd have told you it was so I could find the privy at night. That's the lie I told. The truth was I couldn't bear to let that light go out. It was the last thing I did for her that still meant anything. As long as I lit it, some part of me was still keeping the door open for somebody. Marin saw it. I watched her see it. She climbed down out of the wagon bed in the failing light, and she looked at that little flame burning on the porch post of a house with no woman in it, and she didn't say a word. But she understood it. I knew she did. She kept a light burning for her dead too, in whatever way a person does. That first night she made us supper out of what little I had, and it was the first hot meal in that house that hadn't tasted of neglect since Clara died. The children ate like wolves. I ate in silence at the head of the table where I always ate, and I watched her move around my dead wife's kitchen, careful, asking where things went instead of assuming, and I felt something I had no business feeling, which was the particular ache of a house being lived in again. I didn't like it. It felt like a betrayal. I got up before I'd half finished and said I had stock to see to, and I went out and stood in the cold by the corral and looked at the lit lantern until the feeling passed. That was how it started, not with love, with a man too far gone in his grief to know he was being saved, and a scarred woman nobody wanted, and a 6-year-old who'd seen clear what the rest of us were too stupid or too frightened to see. She settled in over the next weeks the way good rain settles into dry ground, slow, and then all at once, and then you couldn't remember the ground without it. The house changed. I'd let it go gray and silent, every surface a little furred with the particular dust of a place where nobody cares anymore, and Marin didn't make a show of fixing it. She just did it, an hour at a time, so that I'd come in from a day on the range and notice the windows let in more light than they had, or that the curtains Clara made had been washed and rehung, or that there were dried flowers in a jar on the sill, yarrow and gayfeather she'd gathered along the creek. She mended the children's clothes. She cut Wesley's hair so he didn't look like a colt anymore, and she learned to plait Etta's. And the morning I came in and found Etta sitting still as a stone for the first time in her life while Marin worked 2 neat braids down her back, both of them serious as surgeons, I had to go back out to the barn for a minute. She was good with Wesley too, which was harder because Wesley had set himself against her. He'd test her, leave his chores half done, talk back, declare loud and often that she wasn't his mother and couldn't tell him anything. And Marin never once rose to it. She didn't scold and she didn't sweet talk. She just held the line, even and quiet, the way you gentle a green horse, never letting him buffalo her and never punishing him for being scared, which is what he was. She didn't try to take Clara's place with him. She made a place of her own. I watched it happen and I told myself it was none of my concern, this thing growing between the woman and my children. I kept to my work and my silence. I took my meals at the head of the table and said little. I lit my lantern every dusk. I was civil to her and no more, and I built a wall a brick at a time between us, because the truth was she scared me more than any storm or any outlaw ever had. She scared me because some mornings I'd find myself looking forward to coming in from the range. Some evenings I'd catch the sound of her and the children laughing in the kitchen, and I'd stand outside the door longer than I needed to. And every time I caught myself doing it, I'd look up at the rise where Clara lay and the guilt would come down on me like cold water, and I'd go in stiff and short and undo whatever small thaw had crept in. She bore it patient. She must have known what I was doing because she was a person who saw things but she never pushed. She'd lost her own people. She knew the country a grieving heart lives in. She gave me room to be a fool in. The cracking came slow, in small ways, the way the river ice goes out, not all at once, but a groan here and a fissure there until one day it's running free and you can't say when it broke. There was the night Etta had a nightmare. She'd get them bad about the fire mostly. She'd somehow gotten it into her small head that the scary fire from Maren's story and her mother's death were the same kind of thing, the way a child's mind welds two dark shapes together, and she'd wake the house screaming. I'd always gone to her before, clumsy, holding her too tight, no good at it, until she cried herself back down out of pure exhaustion. But that night by the time I got up, Maren was already in the children's room. I stopped in the dark hall outside the door. Maren had Etta in her lap in the rocker by the window, and she wasn't telling her there was nothing to be scared of the way I always had, the lie all the grown-ups tell. She was saying low, I know it's a frightening thing. I'm frightened of fire too, did you know that? Even now, so I'll tell you what I do. And she told my daughter in the dark about counting the lit windows of a town to make herself feel safe, about how a light in the dark means somebody's awake and keeping watch and you're not alone. And she carried Etta to the window and she pointed out at the one light burning on that whole black prairie, the lantern, my lantern, on the porch post below, and she said, "See there? Your daddy keeps that lit all night long, so that anybody lost in the dark can find their way home. So you never have to be afraid of the dark out here, because there's always that light, and your daddy's the one keeps it burning." I stood in that hallway in my nightshirt with my back against the wall, and I cried like I hadn't cried at my own wife's grave, because she'd taken the saddest, most secret thing I did, that stubborn little light I kept for a woman who was never coming home, and she'd turned it into something for my living children. She'd made my grief into a comfort for my daughter without ever once making me explain it, without ever once asking why a widower lit a lantern every night for nobody. She just understood it and made it kind. I didn't go in. I went back to my cold bed and lay awake till dawn. After that, the wall I'd built got harder to keep up. We started to talk a little. In the evenings after the children slept, instead of going straight out to the corral, I'd linger over coffee, and she'd sit with her mending and we'd talk about the stock, the weather, the price of beef, safe things, and then less safe things. She told me about her husband, a good man, a wheelwright, careful and kind and not given to laughing, and about her boy Thomas, who'd have been 8 now. She told it plain, no weeping. But I learned to hear the grief underneath the plainness, the way I hoped she could hear mine. I told her about Clara. First time I'd said my wife's name out loud to another grown person since the funeral. It came out of me cracked and strange, and Maren just listened, the way she listened to Etta about the calf, like it was the most important news in the territory, and when I was done she didn't say any of the useless things people say. She said, "She sounds like she was easy to love." And I said, she was. And we sat there a while in the quiet, 2 people with their dead between them, and for the first time the quiet didn't feel like a thing I was enduring. It felt like a thing we were keeping together. But Cedar Wells hadn't changed its mind about Maren Sayre. I'd take her in on supply days, and the town that had unseen her on the street that first morning kept right on unseeing her, only now with an edge to it, because a scarred woman they could pity from a distance was one thing, but a scarred woman keeping house for a widower out on the Stony Run was a thing they could talk about. And they did. I heard it. The hardware man's wife stopped talking when Maren came in the store and started up again, pointed when she left. Mrs. Pruitt at the boarding house took to calling her that woman loud enough to carry. There was talk about the arrangement, ugly talk, the kind that says a thing without saying it, about a man and a woman alone out on a ranch with no wife's grave even cold yet. Never mind it was 2 years. Never mind she slept in the lean-to room and I in mine and a wall and all my grief between us. They didn't care for the truth. The truth made no story. The worst of it was the day in the mercantile when Mrs. Prout, with 3 other women around her and Marin 2 aisles over within plain earshot, said, in that carrying voice, that it was no wonder that one couldn't get a husband or save her own child with a face like that God marks the ones he means us to keep clear of, and a sensible town would mind the mark. I have done a few things in my life I'm not proud of, but I'm not ashamed of what I did then. I set down the sack of flour I was holding and I walked over to Mrs. Prout in her circle, and I took off my hat the way you do to a lady, and I said, quiet, so they all had to lean in to hear it, which made them part of it whether they liked it or not. Ma'am, that woman walked into a burning house to try and reach her boy. She came out alive and she spent every day since wishing she hadn't. There's no mark on her but the one she got being braver than anybody in this room will ever have cause to be. You want to talk about who God's marked. He marks the ones who run toward the fire. The rest of us just stand on the street and stare. I put my hat back on. She's the finest person to come to this town in a long while, and she keeps my children better than they've been kept since their own mother died. And the next person who says a word against her in my hearing can take it up with me direct. The store was dead silent. Marin was standing 2 aisles over with a tin of coffee in her hand, and she was looking at me, and her face had done a thing I'd never seen it do. Then she set the coffee down and walked out, and I found her by the wagon, and her hands were shaking. You shouldn't have, she said. I know, I said. They'll only say worse now. Let them. She looked up at me, and it was the strangest thing. There were tears standing in her eyes, but she was almost angry. I have spent 4 years, she said, low and fierce, making myself small enough that nobody has to look at me, making myself useful enough and quiet enough and invisible enough that I can pass through a place without anybody having to be reminded of the fire. It's the only way I know how to live now. And you stood up in a full store and made everybody look at me. At all of it, her voice broke. Why would you do that? And I stood there in the cold wind with my hat in my hands, and I said the truest thing I'd said in 2 years, and it surprised me more than it surprised her. Because I'm tired of being a man who looks away, I said. I've been looking away from everything since Clara died, from my children, from my own life, from you. And I find I'm not willing to look away from you anymore, Marin, that's all. I don't know what it means yet, but I'm done looking away. She didn't say anything. She got up into the wagon. We drove the hour and a half home in a silence different from any we'd had before, a full silence, a charged one, the air before a storm. And when we came over the last rise and the lantern was burning on the porch post in the dusk, she looked at it a long time, and then she looked at me, and she said, so soft I near missed it under the wind. You light it for her. I did, I said. I've lit it for her 2 years. She nodded slow, and then she said, I think she'd want you to start lighting it for something that's still here. I didn't have an answer for that. I drove the team on down to the barn, but the word stayed in me all through the chores and the supper and the children's bedtime, lodged like a splinter working its way toward the surface, something that's still here. Winter came down on us hard that year. It came the way it does on the high plains a few cold mornings, a skin of ice on the trough, and then one afternoon in the second week of December the sky went the color of a dead fire, and the wind swung around to the north, and I knew, the way you come to know, that we were in for it. I'd been out on the far range all that day pulling the last of the stock down toward the home pastures, me and Wesley both, because the boy had finally, grudgingly, started to ride out with me, and I'd let him, glad of it, glad of the company even if neither of us said 3 words an hour. We were a good ride out when the storm hit, and it hit like a wall 1 minute thin snow. The next a white roaring nothing where you couldn't see your horse's ears. I got Wesley in clothes and we made for home by the lay of the land and a great deal of luck, and we got the horses in the barn and ourselves to the house half frozen, and I thought, that's it, we're through the worst of it, we're home. Etta was gone. Marin met us at the door white as the snow. The girl had been fretting all afternoon about the calf with the white face, the one she'd named, the one that hadn't come down with the others. It was still out, she'd said. It would freeze, somebody had to bring it in, and Marin had told her no, told her to stay put, had been watching her every minute. And then for the space of time it takes to bring wood in from the pile. Just that long, the back door had banged and the child was gone out into the white after her calf. I have lived a hard life and buried people I loved, and I had never in all of it known fear like I knew standing in that doorway. The storm was full dark now and screaming, and somewhere out in it was my 6-year-old daughter in a too-short coat, and a man could walk 50 feet from his own door in that and never find his way back, and freeze within sight of his own light and never know it. I was already turning for the door. Marin caught my arm. "You can't see your hand," she said. "You'll die out there and find nothing. Eli, think." "That's my daughter. I know who she is." Her voice cracked like a whip and steadied. "Listen to me. The calf was in the south draw by the dead cottonwood. She pointed it out to me this morning. She'd been watching it. She'll have gone where she last saw it. It's downwind. It's the only shelter out there. We don't search the whole prairie. We go to the draw." She was already pulling on Clara's old coat and wrapping a wool scarf over her face. "And we don't go blind. Get every lamp in this house. Get the lantern off the porch. We light this place up like a town, and we tie a line to the porch post and we work out from it. And whatever happens, we can find our way back to the light. Do you understand me? We do not let go of the light." And God help me, in the worst hour of my life, I did exactly what she said, because she was the only one of us still thinking. We lit every lamp and stood them in the windows. I took the lantern down off the porch post, my lantern, Clara's lantern, the light I'd kept burning 2 years for a dead woman. And I tied one end of the long picket rope to that same post and the other around my waist. And Marin did the same with a second line. And we went out into the white together with that lantern between us, calling, working down toward the south draw with the wind trying to tear us off our feet. It was Marin found her. Of course it was. She'd known where to look. Down in the south draw in the lee of the dead cottonwood. My Etta had curled herself up small against the calf she'd come to save, the dumb beast's warmth, and the windbreak of the bank, the only 2 things between her and dying, and her child's instinct or her guardian angel had put her in the one spot on that whole frozen prairie a person might live through it. She was blue and barely conscious, and she was alive. Marin got to her first, and I will see it the rest of my life, that scarred woman who'd run into one fire and not come out with the one she went in for, gathering my half-frozen daughter up out of the snow and pressing the child's face into her own warmth and saying her name over and over. "Etta, Etta, I've got you, I've got you, I'm not letting go." And the lantern in my hand throwing its small light over the both of them in all that howling dark. We got her home on the rope, hand over hand, back to the lit windows. We stripped the frozen clothes off her and wrapped her in every blanket in the house, and Marin got into the bed with her to warm her with her own body, and held her through the whole black night while the storm beat the house, and I built the fire up to roaring, and Wesley, my hard, wary boy, sat on the floor by the bed holding his sister's cold foot in both his hands and crying without any shame at all. And not one of us said the thing we were all thinking, which was that an hour later, a wrong guess at the draw, and we'd have been digging another grave on the rise. She lived. By morning the color was coming back into her and she was fussing about the calf which, it turned out, Marin had thought to drive home ahead of us, so even that the woman had saved. By noon Etta was sitting up demanding to know if she could go see it. Children are made of something we lose. I went out alone that morning while the others slept, into the still white world the storm had left behind, everything blinding and silent. I walked up the rise to Clara's grave. I stood there a long time in the snow, and I talked to her out loud, The first time I'd done it like a fool, like a man does. I told her about the night. I told her about the woman who'd known where to look, who'd thought of the light when I'd have run blind into the dark and died and left our children with nobody. I told her I'd kept her lantern lit 2 years and I didn't regret a night of it, but that I was a man and not a ghost, and I had 2 children who were still here and needed a whole father, not the half of one I'd been. And I asked my dead wife's leave, standing over her grave in the snow, which I know some would think strange, but grief has its own manners. I asked her if she'd mind very much if I let myself live again. If I let myself love the scarred woman sleeping in our house, who'd run toward the fire when I'd have run away from it. The wind moved in the cottonwoods. That's all. There's never any answer. But I came down off that rise lighter than I'd gone up it, and I'd swear to you the cold felt clean instead of cruel, and I knew what I was going to do. I found Marin in the kitchen. She was washing the lamp chimneys we'd had in all the windows, and she had dark rings under her eyes from the sleepless night, and the scar stood out white on her tired face, and I thought she was about the finest thing I had ever seen. "I want to tell you something," I said, "and I'd be obliged if you'd let me get through it before you say anything back, because I'm out of practice and I'll lose my nerve if you stop me." She set down the chimney and the rag and folded her hands and waited, that listening way she had. "I hired you to keep house," I said. "I told you that's all it was. That's all it is. I think those were my words. I told you that because 2 years ago I decided I was finished, that my living was done and the best of me was up on that rise, and all I had left to do was tend my grief and raise my children grim and wait my turn. I'd quit. I want you to know that's the man you came out here to, a man who'd quit. I had to stop and steady myself. And then you walked in. And you washed the windows, and you braided Etta's hair, and you made my secret little light into a comfort for my child instead of a shrine to my dead. And you stood there last night, and thought when I was ready to run blind into the storm. And you found my daughter, and you held her, and you said, 'I'm not letting go.' And somewhere in the middle of all that, I don't know just when, I started living again. You did that. A woman this town can't even bring itself to look at walked into my dead house and turned the lamps back on. Her eyes were wet, but she held still, the way she had that first day with Etta's hand around her fingers, held still like a wild thing, afraid to believe a kind hand was real. "I'm not asking you for an answer today," I said. "You came here grieving as bad as me, and I won't crowd you, but I'm done pretending it's just a wage and a room. I want you to stay. Not as the housekeeper, as the woman of this place. My wife, if you'll ever have me, when you're ready, in a year or 10 of them, whenever. And if you won't, if it's not in you, then you stay anyway as long as you like, and I'll never speak of it again, and I'll be grateful to you the rest of my days regardless." But I had to say it, because you told me to start lighting that lantern for something that's still here. And you're what's still here, Marin. You and those 2 children. You're my whole living world, and I near let myself stay too dead to see it. For a long moment she didn't say anything. The clock ticked. Out in the yard Wesley was throwing snowballs at the calf shed, and we could hear Etta shrieking with laughter, "Alive, alive." Then Marin Sayer crossed the kitchen, and she took my 2 hands in her 2 scarred ones, and she looked up at me, scar and all, no flinching, the way she'd looked at me that first day in the street. "I ran into the fire for them," she said, "and I've spent 4 years believing that the only thing I was good for after was making myself small and getting through. I made my peace with never being seen again. I made my peace with it." Her voice shook. "And then a little girl took my hand in a dirt street, and her father stood up in a store full of people and made them all look at me." A tear went down over the scar. "You want to know the cruelest thing about being unseen, Eli? It's that you start to believe you deserve it. And your children, you've spent these months teaching me I don't." She drew a breath. "I don't need a year. I've had 4 years too many of being careful. Yes, the answer is yes, to staying, to being the woman of this place, to you, to all of it. The answer is yes. I won't tell you what I did then, except that there were no more chimneys washed that afternoon, and that when Etta came banging in from the snow, she found her father, and the mama she'd picked standing in the middle of the kitchen holding onto each other. And she let out a whoop you could have heard in Cedar Wells, and went tearing back out to tell her brother. And Wesley came in slower, and looked at the two of us a long while with his hard, wary face. And then he said, gruff, 10 years old and trying so hard to be a man. Well, somebody better teach Etta to mind the back door before she freezes us all to death, which was the closest a boy like that could come to yes asterisk, and I clapped him on the shoulder and we were a family, just like that. We were a family. We were married in the spring, when the gayfeather came up purple along the creek, by a circuit preacher under the cottonwoods, with the children for witnesses and the calf, grown to a fat yearling now, bawling from the corral through the whole thing. I'd sent word to Cedar Wells, but I hadn't expected anyone, and I was right not to expect Mrs. Prout or her circle. But the hired men came, and the doctor who tried to save Clara and failed and never forgiven himself either, and a few of the rougher families from the outlying claims who'd never had the luxury of caring what a person's face looked like, only whether their hands were willing, and they came, and Marin had a small plain wedding after all, in a town's worth of people who'd finally decided to look at her. The town came around in time. Towns do slow, the way a man does. It helped that Marin turned out to be the best hand with a fever and a broken bone for 50 miles, and that when the diphtheria went through 2 winters later, she rode out to claims nobody else would go near and sat up nights with strangers' children, scar and all, and saved more than a few that the doctor couldn't get to. People will forgive a face a great deal once it's the face that came when their child was dying. Mrs. Prout never did say a kind word to her, but she stopped saying cruel ones, which from Mrs. Prout was as near to grace as the woman could manage. Marin didn't hold it against her. I spent 4 years deciding I was the mark on me, she said once. I can't very well blame a town for taking longer than I did to see it different. We had a hard life and a good one. We had lean years and one terrible one, and we had 2 more children in time, a boy and a girl, and Wesley grew up tall and steady and took over more of the ranch every year. And Etta grew up into a fierce, kind woman who still, to this day, says whatever it is the rest of us are too frightened to say. There's a scar Marin carries that the children's children climb up to study with their small, honest hands, and she lets them, and tells them the true story of it, the brave one, the one I told a store full of people that day that their grandmother ran toward the fire. Clara's grave is still up on the rise. We tend it together, Marin and I, all these years. She plants it with yarrow every spring. I never did feel I had to choose between the two of them, the dead and the living. A heart's not a stall with room for one. It's a country, and it gets bigger the more you love. And every night at dusk still, after all these years, I go out and I light the lantern on the porch post. My hands are old now and it takes me longer, but I light it. Marin asked me once early on if I wanted to stop, if it was a sad thing for me, a shrine, and I told her no. I told her it was the opposite of sad. I told her I lit it the first winter so my new bride would have a light to come home to in the dark, and I lit it 2 years for a wife who'd gone where no light could reach her, and now I light it for the woman asleep in our bed, and the children in their rooms and the grandchildren when they visit, for everyone I love who's still here, and for the memory of the one who isn't, all of it, the same small flame. A light in the dark means somebody's awake and keeping watch. Marin told my frightened daughter that night long ago. It means you're not alone. She was right. She was right about that and about most things. I was a man who'd let his light dwindle down to a habit he kept for the dead, and a scarred woman the whole world looked past walked up out of the dark and showed me what the flame was really for. It was never for the ones who are gone, their past needing it. It's for the ones still here in the dark, finding their way home. I keep it burning yet.